Afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is Fred Starr, chairman of the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute in Washington and in Stockholm. And we have a very, very important theme today. It is the city of Kashgar, the capital of the province of Xinjiang in China, meaning new territory. It was newly added a few hundred years ago to the Chinese state. And it is has been the subject, Xinjiang, of great concern in the last couple of years, as you know, over the internment camps or education programs that have been set up on a very mass scale in that region for ethnic Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and Tajiks. The subject today is not those camps, which still deserve very close attention, but rather the city of Kashgar. Now, Kashgar it's a large city. It's well over 500,000 people in population. It is also the most ancient, most significant early Turkic capital anywhere. It was a city of some distinction before other Turkic cities appeared elsewhere. And it became the capital of the Karahanid Empire over 1,000 years ago. And this empire conquered Central Asia. It conquered Samarkand, Bukhara, and so on, and became a very sophisticated enterprise indeed, producing people like Mahmud of Kashgar, who was the great geographer and linguist of his era. He really put Turkic languages on the map, and in a grand book he explained all the differences among the Turkic dialects and languages and helped people who were his readers to learn any of them. It was an astonishing achievement, and in his book he also published the first map, the earliest map that exists today of Japan. Now, how that happened is another story. We don't need to get into. Another great citizen of Kashgar, and it was Yusuf of Balasagun. He was born in what is now Kyrgyzstan, and is, by the way, a national hero in the Kyrgyz Republic. But Yusuf wrote the first great book in a Turkic language, and it is a guide to living, how to live. And there it stands as a monument. So this Kashgar is not just some provincial nowhere. This is a city of great distinction, deep historical meaning for the entire Turkic world. And therefore, its fate at the time of these developments that have been taking place within the People's Republic of China, its fate is very important indeed. And that's what we're about today. We're fortunate to have with us Bill Drexel, who has done a study on Kashgar today for the Uyghur Human Rights Project. Mr. Drexel is a graduate of Yale. He did work at Cambridge in England in political theory, and then spent a year as a Schwarzman Scholar at the Tsinghua University in China, and where he was, by the way, researching state surveillance. I doubt if he'd be doing that research there today. We're very happy to have Bill Drexel report on his findings, and then there'll be ample time for discussion. Bill, you're on.
Well, many thanks, and thanks to the whole Central Asia Caucasus Institute. I'm really glad to have this chance to present the research I've done. Just to reiterate, that was with the Uyghur Human Rights Project. There's a 70 to 80 page report on their website, and this is sort of kind of covering the basics of that ground. All the photos I'll be using are from that report as well. So if you want sort of to refer to anything or you want any more information, it is there. I believe there's a PowerPoint that is coming along with this. I don't know if that's up yet or not, but thank you for tuning in. Sorry, at least on my own on my own computer, I'm coming across a bit blue, but bear with me. Right, so if we could just rewind to the beginning of that PowerPoint. Yes, so this is the cover of the report, Kashgar Coerced, Forced Reconstruction, Exploitation, and Surveillance in the Cradle of Uyghur Culture. This photo is from a photographer called Edith Rowe. It's of a Uyghur man after the demolitions in the old city of Kashgar that occurred back in beginning in 2009. So he's standing in the site of his former neighborhood. If we could just go to the next slide. So I just want to orient everyone. I know there are a lot of kind of Kashgar experts or Uyghur experts or Central Asian experts, but for the kind of the layman, I've circled in red here where Kashgar is, just to give you a sense of what we're talking about. So it's on the extreme edge of kind of territorial China today. But as you can see, it's really central. If we're talking about Central Asia, Kashgar is kind of at the center of Asia, at the heart of Asia. As was just mentioned, a really key city in the history of Central Asia, in the history of the Silk Road, in kind of the annals of Turkic history. So I think maybe the best thing would be to contextualize my own experience with the city and where this report has come out of. Next slide. So I should be straightforward that by training, I'm not an expert on Central Asia. I don't speak Uyghur, and my Chinese is too basic to be of much use for kind of professional research. I was in China from the 2018 to 2019 academic year studying state surveillance. My focus at that time, though, at least by intention, was surveillance of other groups within China. And my kind of connection to the Uyghur situation, I very much and almost literally kind of stumbled into in a trip to Xinjiang, and particularly Kashgar, in October of 2018. So 2 out of the 3 of these pictures are mine. On the left is sort of when I went to Kashgar, what the city looked like. You can see a really extreme number of Chinese flags. I went basically to get a comparative view of the surveillance that I was exploring elsewhere. My intention was really very loose. This was when the information of the camps was really just exploding on the international news scene. And there was a group of friends from my program who were going to make a trip to Xinjiang largely as tourists. And I joined them thinking that, it's not my kind of main area of study, but it's what it would be useful to get a comparative sense of what is going on there. While I was in Kashgar, I had a really kind of happenstance, harrowing experience in which I kind of went rogue from the group I was with, and befriended a couple of locals to the city who gave me a kind of off-the-record tour of the political contours and the recent history of the city. And the thing that really deeply disturbed me is the degree to which, Kashgar is not what it seems. If you go there, there is an old city that's sort of a tourist constructed world, the significance of which is not entirely obvious when you're initially there. And the local kind of friends who I developed kept on telling me over and over, if you really want to see the real Kashgar, you have to go to this Yarbashi neighborhood. They called it by its Chinese name. That's depicted in the top right corner. It's sort of an outpost of the traditional architecture that remained, but it's closed to foreigners during the day. I went at night. and discovered that it was entirely deserted. I found X's spray painted on doors that were padlocked, abandoned streets, very little information and no explanation for what had happened. Just clear evidence of a very recent mass disappearance. As recently as 6 weeks prior, travel tourist blogs had talked about this night market there, but these people were gone without a trace. So that's when I reached out to the Uyghur Human Rights Project, reported what I had seen. They related that they had no news of this, but that, you know, at a time when whole neighborhoods were being emptied into re-education camps, it's likely that's what happened to this neighborhood. But it was a deeply harrowing experience in the sense that here you are in this ancient, you know, extraordinarily unique architectural kind of masterpiece that's been wordlessly deserted, disappeared, without the knowledge of many of the locals, or at least without open discussion. And then across the street, in like kind of a stone's throw away, there is a night market full of these sort of commercialized expressions of cultural vibrancy that are to some degree surveillance induced. So since that time, I spent several months researching the history of Kashgar to try to understand how this happened and what it means. And as has been mentioned, I think it is a fascinating story. I mean, for one thing, I would like people who go to Kashgar in the future to understand just what has happened there, because it is not obvious if you're not a specialist. You can easily, and I've seen many people do this, go to the city, see it for what it's been constructed to be by the Chinese state, and totally misunderstand what has happened to the city. And second of all, I think one of the really key things about it is that Kashgar today has been, you know, it's this city that is not, you know, a household name in my part of the world, but has this incredible history, deep significance, and has collided with a sort of totalitarian surveillance smart city model that in a lot of ways is unprecedented. So there are a lot of lessons to be drawn from Kashgar, and that's kind of what I'd like to present now. So next slide. Just to give a sense, this is what the old city of Kashgar looked like prior to its reconstruction. It's a 2 to 3 millennia old city. As we got from the introduction, there's a lot of history there, deeply significant for Central Asia, Central Asian history. As you saw on the map, it was a meeting point of great cultures and traditions. It's where the Persians would meet kind of South Asians, would meet traders from the Silk Road, would meet other kind of Central Asian actors. And it has a rich history of Buddhism, of Zoroastrianism, of Islam, of Nestorianism. I mean, if you were to look up kind of the ancient Christian history of China, you would largely hear about a Uyghur monk called Bar Salma who traveled all the way through into Europe. The layers of religious history, of cultural history that are kind of inscribed in this city are pretty phenomenal and largely under recognized. The significance of the city for the Uyghurs, though, really needs to be understood for what it is, which is this is not just a city that has kind of outsized ethnic importance. When I spoke with Uyghurs, when I interviewed them, especially from Kashgar, you get the sense that Kashgar holds a kind of quasi-religious significance to the Uyghur people. The reasons for that are many. One of them is that after the Cultural Revolution, the Red Guards destroyed much of the Uyghurs' kind of cultural artifacts, written works, etc. But the city of Kashgar had a very unique kind of architectural socio ecosystem that supported a way of life and that kind of inscribed a variety of traditions. So as you can see, it has this sort of earthen construction that's very labyrinthine, interconnected roofs, tunnels underneath the ground. When you would walk into Kashgar prior to the 2000s, you would pretty immediately be struck by just how unusual and unique and beautiful just the kind of material culture of the city is, just how the architecture is not like a lot of other places. And after the destruction of all these cultural artifacts, this city, what remained of it, really sort of held layers of Uyghur tradition and came to kind of instantiate the Uyghur connection to their ancient past. And it's for this reason that the city was so significant and was preserved by many of the sort of reconstructions that took place throughout China in the 80s and 90s. And just to note, I mean, there are a variety of architectural features of the city that are hard to describe in this short period of time for their depth of meaning, but courtyards, woodworks, familial traditions, the layout of the city was all geared around, kind of preserved, not only their kind of current Islamic heritage, but vestiges of their Manichaean past, of their Buddhist past, of kind of every layer was kind of inscribed in this city, which is what made it so important, and also what's made it such a unique collision point of kind of the Chinese state with the Uyghur people recently. So I'll just give a roadmap. We're going to talk about Reconstruction, economic exploitation, and then surveillance as kind of tying all these things together. But Kashgar, for its immense cultural importance, stands a bit as a inflection point that can be a useful, a valuable way to kind of consider what is happening in Xinjiang in a broader sense today. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to stress, most people know, I mean, if you know about Kashgar, you likely know that there was a large reconstruction effort that occurred from 2009. I just want to draw attention, that's true, but there were a lot of very significant kind of projects and reconstruction efforts that occurred before 2009 and with really significant results. So this is Idka Square on the left. We see from 2002 on the right, 2005. You can see that the kind of historic Rose Garden has been taken away, but also all these houses on the northern side have had families that have been largely relocated. And I'm told from interviews, kind of from the early 2000s, really subjected to a high degree of community surveillance and yeah, a variety of community destroying lifestyle, culture destroying processes that early. And this is just one of several examples of that. If we go to the next slide, the government for kind of starting in 2009, started implementing its plan to demolish they projected 85% of the historic old city. This is a picture from, I believe, 2011, where a photographer called Stefan Giens kind of mapped out where these demolitions were happening, where they were being rebuilt. According to the Congressional Executive Committee on China, this effort actually resettled nearly half of all Kashgaris in the city. That's quite a really, I mean, everyone from the old city was more or less relocated. Many were able to move back, many weren't. And it's actually worth noting that, this is really irreplaceable architecture, an irreplaceable and totalizing destruction of a historic ancient city with a very distinctive style. The Global Heritage Network estimates that actually more than 85%, 90% of the old city was eventually destroyed. I think it's likely that it may even have been more, in the sense that you see the two areas outlined in blue at the top and on the far right. At least the top saw serious reconstruction, even though it was slated to be preserved. And the far right was the area that I stumbled into October of 2018, which also looks like it's slated for demolition soon. So whatever vestiges remain have largely been kind of either moved towards ethnic tourism or slated for destruction. But just to give a sense, in the next slide, this was totalizing. I mean, this is an example of what it would look like while this was happening, but huge swaths of land destroyed, rebuilt, and it was recognized as a kind of global loss of heritage. Saving Antiquities for Everyone, Global Heritage Network, the European Parliament, UNESCO, all protested the demolition of Kashgar. And it was perhaps, I mean, it was one of the largest groupings of mud brick architecture in Central Asia and likely the world. Next slide. This is just another kind of exemplar of what this would look like as they were rebuilding. But the sad truth is that pretty much everything was rebuilt. It's just the satellite images could only capture the parts that happened to be raised at any particular moment. So we don't have a complete record of what that looked like. Next slide. So here's just a comparison of what Kashgar's old city kind of looked like before and after. Prior, it had a very unique material construction kind of method, labyrinthine, very beautiful and multi-layered interconnected houses, family units with these beautiful courtyards. Afterwards, wide boulevards, more kind of squared, completely different physical architecture, just an entirely different sort of feeling. My favorite description of it comes from a journalist who called it the new Kashgar kind of Islamic Lego aesthetic. I think that's pretty accurate. But the upshot is, this historic city, the cultural cradle of the Uyghur people, was entirely razed between 2009 and 2014 for a variety of reasons, but which laid the foundation for greater economic exploitation and kind of comprehensive surveillance throughout the city. So we'll move to the economic exploitation really quick now. In the next slide. The economic exploitation, this is a shot from kind of a typical touristy advertising shot, and it's basically showing Uyghurs doing one of their kind of traditional dances, but it's worth noting, a lot of people call it Uyghur World or Uyghur Disneyland. This city has been co-opted into a really, at points, grotesque, commercialized, commodified version of its culture. And after the old city was kind of reconstructed, the local government, the Communist Party Committee of the old city, leased the whole of the old city to a Beijing-based investment group, who then advertised it as a living Uyghur folk museum. This has occurred while alongside this over the kind of 90s and early 2000s, a variety of state-led initiatives encouraged significant investment and reconstruction throughout Kashgar, not just the old city, basically remaking the city. And as we know from particularly since 2016, 2017, there's been a forced labor campaign alongside this sort of commodification and exploitation, selling of the Uyghur culture through Kashgar. In 2018, Kashgar Prefecture announced the intention to put 100,000 graduates of internment camps into work in industrial parks, which amounts to putting approximately 20% of the entire adult Uyghur population of Kashgar into coerced labor of some sort or another. If you kind of think about it at the baseline, when we look at Kashgar today, it is a very disturbing image where the public face of the city is kind of full of these commercialized representations, extractive kind of rituals of Uyghur culture being performed for tourists, while behind closed doors, 20% of the Uyghur population of Kashgar is forced into coerced labor. So you have this kind of jubilant facade kind of hiding this really dark reality of economic exploitation. Next slide. The thing that's perhaps most disturbing, though, and the linchpin that sort of draws together the kind of physical reconstruction with the economic exploitation, is the growth of Kashgar as a surveillance city, as I call it, a totalitarian smart city. Throughout the city, the city as a whole has been wired to support an ecosystem of totalizing surveillance. And there are a lot of ways to kind of look at this as a kind of urban ecosystem, but we saw the last picture was kind of at the reconstructed front wall of the city. That wall is incomplete. It's also artificial. It was recreated for touristic purposes. There's a new wall around Kashgar, where the old wall kept invaders out, protected the city. The new wall is sort of an encircling speckling of re-education camps that silently but forcefully reinforce this new social order. So this is a picture of one of the earliest discovered re-education camps that's just outside of Kashgar, one of the many encircling Kashgar, where we had the kind of mass internment of Uyghurs. Next slide. But certainly, when you walk through Kashgar, you're confronted by, it's inescapable, the number of surveillance cameras always pointed at you. On the left, you see a typical convenience police station. These are kind of systematically dispersed throughout the city. They're hubs of surveillance that monitor population and the goings on of the city in real time. It's worth comparing that with the prior kind of, even just the geographical layout, the geographical organization of the city. Kashgar historically, and there have been actually studies on this, it has been pretty organically and naturally evenly distributed around community mosques. So every community mosque radiates out, and there are a pretty consistent number of families that are ordered by the tradition of that community mosque throughout the city. And those have been effectively replaced by these new centers of communal order that are run through these hubs of surveillance that monitor everything and that can track people, particularly Uyghurs, in real time in their cultural capital, see who they're meeting, how much electricity they're using, all tied to, their biometric information, their blood, DNA samples, etc., and can adjudicate the speeds at which Uyghurs can move through and the activities they can kind of enact in their own cultural city, their kind of cultural homeland. So the whole thing becomes kind of a huge normalizing ritual, if that makes sense. This ancient oasis city of Silk Road is now a sort of effectively curated surveillance kind of organized city. On the right, you see these pictures in the center of the old city, just across from the famous Idka Mosque, largest in China. Pictures scrolling through Xi Jinping in this giant LED. It's palpable. The city can listen to you. It's not just facial recognition, it's voice recognition that can transcribe Uyghur speech and translate it into Chinese and scan it in real time. It is a fully interactive city directed towards ethnic repression. Next slide. So I'm going to start to wrap up here. This is really just a bird's eye view of how this ancient, deeply significant.
We have only a couple of minutes.
Okay. Ancient city really kind of transformed in a totalizing way through a reconstruction that made the way for really pervasive economic exploitation and widespread surveillance. I will say it should give us all pause of what is possible in terms of urban reconstruction and the kind of new horizons of ethnic repression in an urban landscape. But we should also remember Kashgar for what it was. That was one thing that all my interviewees really wanted to impress upon me was, I asked them at the end of every interview, what do you want the world to know about Kashgar? And they never focused on the anger or the sense of how grotesque the sort of processes that have been executed on it are. They always focused on how beautiful it was and what a significant place it was. So that's where I'll end as well. Open to any questions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Let me just note that you've presented here the story of with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it's very brief in time. Over a decade ago, the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute published a book, Xinjiang, China's Muslim borderland, in which one of the excellent authors projected that the opening of a railroad to Kashgar, which was then only contemplated, would bring the same results in Kashgar that it had in Urumqi, the official capital of Xinjiang, which was never a great Turkic city. But unlike that, Kashgar was and is, and he projected that this would be the end of the traditional Kashgar, and it turns out that he was right. I'm wondering if you can say something about what's happened to the people. Who is studying the population of Kashgar? Where are they going? What are they doing? What are they thinking? Are they connected with emigre groups? What are their sources of information? In other words, okay, this is a fact. We've seen it. Now where do we go from here?
Right. Well, I think as with the whole of Xinjiang, but maybe especially Kashgar, it has become extremely difficult to study. Diasporic groups obviously now are speaking out more and more, but the ability to gain access and to kind of on the ground look at Kashgar is really diminishing. And the kind of weight of China against studies like this is really significant. And any Uyghurs who would want to do this research would do so at the risk of relatives who may still be back there having really severe repercussions.
So is it fair to say that you conclude from your study and your brief visit that Kashgar is history, that the culture that it sustained is fundamentally gone? Is that the situation? Or do you see that this is set in train some kind of opposition that may at some future point make itself felt? Is there any evidence for the latter?
There's no visible evidence. If it were, I mean, I think that diasporic communities obviously will try to preserve what they can of their culture. But insofar as Kashgar as an architectural cityscape kind of brings together a certain culture, that is gone.
You didn't mention language.
Right. So linguistically, there's a lot of good work by a scholar called Darren Byler about the way in which the Uyghur language has been basically penetrated by Chinese surveillance. And yeah, I mean, I think that as much as English communications are being watched, all the more so Uyghur communications, Uyghur scholarship on these issues, I'm sure, are being monitored. But as you say, the language is preserved in diasporic communities. There is a love of Kashgar, a desire to see kind of the Uyghur culture as a whole preserved. But it is tragic in as far as this ancient city is concerned. It's
okay. Stephanie Driscoll, do we have any calls?
Hello, we had one question. If there is any expectation that Uyghurs in re-education camps will be released at some point. You touched on this a little bit, but you could elaborate.
Well, I mean, the reports are that a lot of them are being released, often into involuntary or forced labor kind of situations. It's also worth noting that, you know, there are different types of internment. There's the internment camps, but incarceration of Uyghurs is kind of just one step off of that and has also been skyrocketing in recent years. But yes, I mean, we are seeing some outflow, some significant outflow from the camps, but into, I mean, they described Xinjiang as a whole and Kashgar even more so, I would say, as an open air prison. Every action you know, the boundary between the internment camp wall and the prison wall and the city wall are not clear. Everything you do is watched. And if you deviate from your prescribed role, there are severe consequences.
Well, let me ask you this. This is you've presented us really a tragic story of loss, of destruction, physical in the sense of architecture, but cultural in the sense of history, of crafts, of language, of religious life, and culture in general. Yes, this is a tragic story, and it's one to which the larger world has responded passively. Yes, there's a resolution from the European Parliament and this organization and that organization, but basically nothing's been done. Even the Turks in Turkey initially spoke up and then were quickly successfully shut up, and they haven't made a peep since. So is this a story? Is this a fait accompli? Is this done? And if so, should we stop agitating over it and instead view it as those many, for example, in the expansion of ancient Rome, those many indigenous cultures and ways of life and even languages that existed even on the Italian peninsula, that were wiped out. They just were absorbed by. Is that what we're talking about? And we should say, yes, this does happen in life. Or are we talking about something that to which we should be still responding in a vigorous manner? Which is it?
Well, I think we definitely need to be responding in a vigorous manner, in a more vigorous manner than we are responding. You're right that we're very late. So if we want to talk about kind of the survival, the perpetuation of Kashgar as this ancient significant city, we are too late in that sense. But lateness doesn't mean there aren't gains to be had. What we have right now is gross human rights violations that are ongoing, and anything we can do to curb those, I think, is deeply significant. I think the other thing we need to recognize, though, is that unlike the kind of other groups you're speaking of, the methods being employed here are in a lot of ways novel. They're subtle in ways that are difficult to pinpoint. They're technologically enabled. Obviously, there's a new study about forced sterilizations of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. I've mentioned in this talk how, you know, you can have now with these technologies, you can have a really kind of effective facade of this, you know, performative facade where you have people treating, you know, celebrating business as usual under coercion of cameras, of camps. So I think we also need to treat it as a learning moment for what can happen in the future, and yeah, salvage what is possible to salvage now as much as we can, and also not let these new forms of coercion and of cultural erasure go unnoticed.
Not mentioned other cities, yet both rings of the Great Taklamakan Desert are lined with ancient great cities, not as large as Kashgar, but no less ancient, and these have become the locus of Uyghur culture and civilization and ethnicity. Just as in the north, you have several cities in the Ili area that have essentially a Kazakh character. Is anyone looking ahead to them? What's going to happen to those cities? Is the story you've told today just going to be repeated in these other places? In other words, is it possible for the Chinese state, for whatever purposes it has in mind, simply to eliminate not just a culture, but an ethnos?
I mean, my own sense is that it is in a lot of ways possible, at least as we talk about the kind of the cities themselves. Again, I think the diaspora can preserve traditions and whatever it has taken from those cities. But I do believe the cities can and are being subsumed. I focused on Kashgar. I know that a lot of people would like a similar study on Hotan and elsewhere. Anywhere that's currently controlled by China, I think, is really in dire straits or probably already destroyed. Even the Uyghur kind of outposts in Urumqi have been wiped out, I believe in 2017 or 2018. It is a concerted, I mean, and this is putting aside shrines and mosques and various other kind of physical architectural spots that just are no more, or that have been very elaborately co-opted.
But let me draw a comparison. Soviet rule in Central Asia, in the rest of Central Asia, existed for 3 generations. At the end of the day, ethnic Kazakhs were a significant minority in their own region. And yet today, it's absolutely turned around. It's a different picture. In language and culture and identity and history, the Kazakhs, the Uzbeks, and Kyrgyz are all reasserting themselves and doing so steadily and in a civilized way and quite successfully. We're talking in the case of Kashgar, in the case of the entirety of Xinjiang, in the case of Uyghurs, we're talking about large populations. We don't know the exact numbers, but you know, it's up around 20+ million people. I'm wondering if your prognosis, which is a gloomy one and maybe stone sober, I'm wondering if it may be too negative.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the Uyghurs as a people, from what I understand of their history, are incredibly resilient and have had great revivals and kind of turnarounds. And I do hope for that, absolutely. And I think there are certainly seeds of that, especially in the diaspora. The thing that is, I mean, I think that the Soviet rule on, I'm not an expert on kind of the rest of Central Asia or what that rule entailed. But the Uyghurs, to be honest, before the last decade, were already subjected to quite a lot of repression and were suppressed severely, especially, I mean, you think about the Cultural Revolution, I mean, that was profoundly destabilizing to their society, to their culture. They survived, and their culture was wounded. But, you know, Kashgar survived. You know, they had these vestiges. The Uyghurs that I have spoken to, at least so far, pretty unanimously have related to me that this is not like the Cultural Revolution, and that whatever's occurring now feels, to them at least, too totalizing to be rebounded from, or at least to see how a rebound could really occur, at least in Xinjiang itself. I hope that's inaccurate. And like I say, resilience is a strange thing. A lot of times you can't see how such a rebound would happen, but the systematicness and the sort of resources that have been poured into this process are really immersive.
Let me raise this question. When the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was set up, SCO, now a generation ago, the first purpose and the first step was to engage the 3 countries with territorial boundaries adjoining Xinjiang, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, to engage them. And great things were promised them, wonderful pluses and gains of all sorts. But the condition was that they were not to allow their territory to be used in any way for communicating or stirring up, communicating decentralization movements or self-governance movements or autonomous movements in Xinjiang. In other words, anyone who was caught engaging in that, whether printing leaflets to be distributed in Kashgar or whatever, anyone caught in any of those 3 countries had to be arrested. And in each case, they've turned over citizens of their country to China. Now, this worked. It effectively neutralized them. Is this a subject that should be re-raised? In other words, China's done an excellent job. You have to respect the thoroughness of this. But there are questions that on a legitimate basis can be considered, like limiting the sovereignty of other states for the sake of their own internal security. In other words, is there a bigger story here that we're missing while we're focusing, as we should, on Kashgar itself?
Well, I think I really agree with your sentiment that we can, there in a unfortunate way, we can kind of hand it to the Chinese in terms of their comprehensiveness, and that it's pretty, in a way, it's impressive. That's reflected in the architecture of Xinjiang, where you really do have a lot of people who go through who don't even realize, you know, who see these reconstructed buildings and think this is what Kashgar looked like. As it relates to kind of the broader geopolitics, so far, I think they've been moderately successful at projecting a sort of similar facade, and exerting this power. But I mean, I do agree, like the pressure that is being exerted transnationally on Uyghurs, directly or indirectly through other governments that are kind of housing the diaspora, really needs to be fought against, really needs to be counterbalanced, and is certainly an issue of sovereignty, kind of indirect ethnic repression. I think whatever can be done to relieve these things, but I think the economics of the situation are really difficult to address.
Yes, you're up against two key matters. One is resources. Xinjiang as a whole, Western Xinjiang, and notably has resources that are very valuable to Beijing. And second, you're up against transportation. The great routes to the west that China has been working so deliberately to open, whether we're talking about Belt and Road Initiative or railroads or new highways and so on, these all pass through or near Kashgar. And so any serious response has to acknowledge that and somehow address it. That said, let me offer by way of conclusion here that you were grateful to Bill Drexel for doing what should have been done long ago, and that is produce a focused study on the city of Kashgar. This is only the first. We hope there'll be more that will focus on such matters as specifically the architecture. That's not been studied in detail. It needs to be the crafts, the state of the language, the condition of religion there, and the culture generally. Is this a cancel project that's working successfully, or are there leaks in it and weak spots in it that should be exploited, not in some anti-Chinese spirit, but for the sake of the cultural identity and existence of a great people? These are questions I hope others start researching. Shame on us for not doing more before now, but it's not too late. As I said at the beginning, with so many people, tens of millions of people, it's hard to imagine that Uyghurs are going to cease to exist. They will have a future. They have a very intelligent, highly educated, and sophisticated immigration in many, many countries. They're in touch with each other. They're active. It's time for the rest of the Western societies and Eastern societies to make contact with them and figure out constructive paths forward for the sake of the culture and civilization of Xinjiang and Kashgar. Thank you very much, Bill Drexel.
Thank you.
We'll be announcing further Zoom forums shortly, and thank you all for participating in this one.